Now, I want you to see something here. The giant was out there, and guess what? David came at the giant before the giant came at David. He heard about it. He heard the giant was out there. He saw what was happening because of the giant. It now becomes part of his life. It's in his life. David knows the giant is there. He doesn't run from it. He goes after it, doesn't he? He makes his intentions known in verse 26 down to verse 32. He makes his intentions known. David sets out to see Goliath what? Defeated. He sets out to see the giant is what? Defeated. As soon as David expresses his desire to see the giant defeated, he's met by criticism. We've already look at verse 28. And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and said, Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? But he says, I know thy pride and thy naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest what? See the battle. He doesn't have a clue what's going on in David's life, does he? Verse 33, Saul said to David, Thou art what? Not able. There will always be plenty of people to say you can't. That you'll never run short in that area in your life. How many friends you have or you don't have, I can assure you, you will always have enough people in your life to tell you you can't. That's why you personally, in your own heart and mind, have to say you can. Regardless of what other people say. Yet as we look at this and we see David, he moves toward the moment when he will face off with the giant. We see a young man who has learned something here about faith and trust in the Lord. I think I have these typed up for you. 3 things I want you to see here. And I'm not going to get through all these, obviously, this morning, but I want you to understand that as David moves towards the giant, David's learned 3 things in his life. And I want you to get this one, because there have been many times in your life that you've asked God, why me? Why me? What did I ever do? Why me? You've asked yourself that question. Why did I lose my job? Why didn't that reprobate sinner who goes to the bar every night of the week lose his job? Why didn't he lose his job? Why did I lose my job? Yep. Why? I me. God's blessed me with a wonderful wife, but I'll have to tell you, there was a time when I said, why her? Why my wife? Why did she have to die? You see, this kind of drives into our driveway, doesn't it? Parks where you live. Because there are going to be some times in your life that you're going to face, and you're going to ask yourself a question. Why did this happen to me? Right? Why him? Why her? Why didn't they get laid off? Why am I the one that has to have chemo? Why me? What is the reason that I have to face? Number 1, David's learned something. David has learned about God's purposes. Look at chapter 16. Chapter 16. Chapter 16. And in verse 13. Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren. And the Spirit of God came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. Now, why David? David had been anointed as king to sit on the throne. Now, I want you to understand something uniquely different about David and Saul. Saul was man's choice. David is who?
God's choice.
God's choice. David knew. I don't know all the details of how to explain this to you. It doesn't mean what I'm about to say we should live a reckless life. It's very clear we should live in the will of God, but I want you to get this. In verse 13, now understand this. David was anointed king, was he not? David was well aware of that. David knew this also. As long as he was in the power of God, now get this, nothing was going to prevent him from sitting on that throne. Nothing. Am I here to say David was invincible? I'm not saying that. But when he was anointed king, and God had his providence, he had David's plan, was to sit on the throne of God, guess what? God was going to make sure that what? Happened. He that hath begun a work in you is faithful to do what? David knew. God's purpose for him was to be what? Here's the thing and I ask myself this question too. When I face this or these giants, I ask myself, is this the way God is preparing me for his purpose? You see when you look at it from that perspective. Number two, David has learned this. He's learned about God's protection. Verse 38 through 40, we know when he talks again about the bear and the lion and so forth. David knew that everything God had done in his past, he was able to do what? In his future. Number three, briefly. See, David, he's learned about God's purposes. He's learned about God's protection. More than those two, anything else that David has learned, he's learned about God's power. Verse 38 through 40. David knew. And I want you to, this becomes very practical to us. Because we want swords and shields and things of that nature. David knew that victory did not reside in swords. He knew that victory did not reside in shields, spears, armor, or bows. How many times have you said, if I only had, I could have done? Oh, if I only had just a little bit more money. If I was just a few more years younger. Hello. David has learned about God's power. Don't give me your sword, David said. I don't need these shields. I don't need all these arrows. I don't need all this stuff. I have what I need. I have the power of God. You have what you need. The power of God in your life. You would go into this battle with the same God and the same weapons that he used before. I thought that was so fascinating because I'm sure that many of these guys had spent probably a year or two's worth salary of what they were going to make being in the army just to get the sword and shield. And David had his little armament with just a few stones and a piece of leather, wasn't it? Well, technically that wasn't his fighting equipment. His fighting equipment was the power of God in his life. That was what David knew. David understood the power of God. He knew that he could go into this battle with the same God, the same equipment he's always used. We've got to get past this mindset. If we only had, then we could do. No. In other words, David's trust was not in the army, the armor, or the armaments. David's trust was in what? Mighty God. The same God who protected him and had given him his victory on the hills of Judea grant him victory in the valley of Elah. David. Understand this, for David. Here's what I want you to see. For David, there was only one giant on that battlefield. There was only one giant there with David. And I want you to understand, it was not Goliath. You see, the giant in David's life was God. The only giant David had in his life was the Lord God Almighty. Verse 26, verse 32, verse 36 through verse 37. That was the only giant that David needed, or even saw, was God. What do you need to face the giants in 2011? It's simply the power of God. Our little church has yet to see the power of God. And we will not see it until we understand what it